My name is Robert Driver. I'm a postdoc at Duke University and welcoming you to the AOS Student Research Grant Seminar Series. And so before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone we have the AOS Student Research Grants, which are the basis of these seminars. And each year the AOS offers funding to students and early career researchers in the form of this grant. And our seminar series celebrates the challenging and innovative work of the grant recipients by sharing the AOS funded or related work to AOS members. And each week we showcase the research or research plans of a 2024, 2023, or 2022 AOS Student Research Grant winner in a seminar style format. And as you saw on the PowerPoint, we have one seminar each week for 15 weeks until December 15th. And I want to thank everyone for being here today, the OS and the AOS Student Affairs Committee, and thank Lauren, our speaker today. And so last thing before we turn our attention to Lauren's research, I wanted to mention if you have any questions, we have a Q&A session at the end of Lauren's talk. And you can participate by raising your hand, and I can unmute you. Or you can write your question in the chat box, or there is also a Q&A box in the Zoom, and I will check all three methods of asking your question to make sure it gets read. And then this is an AOS sponsored event, so we're following the AOS virtual meeting event code of professional conduct. I will post a link to that in the chat, as well as a link to contact the Student Affairs Committee if you have any questions, and a link to the post-seminar evaluation form, where you can put in any comments to help us improve the seminar. So we thank everybody who fills that out. Last additional announcement, sorry, I'm going on and on here, or that nominations and applications are open for AOS Council, special membership classes, and awards. So I will post a link to the nomination page, and Chris Ann will also post a link in the chat at the end, just to remind our members to have their voice heard and vote. Okay, so today, Lauren Gingerella is currently a Ph.D. candidate in forest resources at the University of Georgia. And Lauren's academic career began with a Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife and Conservation Biology from the University of Rhode Island. And following undergraduate for the next 5 years, Lauren performed research in a variety of field biologist positions in New Jersey and Georgia, focusing on coastal ecosystems and shorebirds. And building off this experience, Lauren then went on to earn her master's degree in forest resources from the University of Georgia, studying the effects of predator enclosures on nest success and productivity in Wilson's plovers. And following graduation, Lauren worked as an assistant conservation director for the North American Land Trust, working with strategic planning and business opportunities for conservation. And Lauren then worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a biological planner, helping sites in the Southeast prioritize resources of concern for conservation. And in 2023, hope I'm getting all these things right, Lauren has a great record here. In August 2023, Lauren returned to the University of Georgia for a PhD in forest resources, studying biodiversity responses to habitat conservation and land use change. So finally, in March 2024, I wanted to mention Lauren is the CEO and launched her own business of chickadee conservation consulting, assisting clients with conservation goals. So with all of that, I will turn it over to Lauren for her talk, From Fairways to Forests, Assessing the Avian Community Response to Habitat Restoration Techniques.
All right, thank you, Robert. And I'm going to share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
All right, how does that look?
Looks great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Robert. And first off, I'd like to thank AOS for inviting me to come speak with you all today about my dissertation research, and for also financially supporting my research as well through a student research grant. So Robert gave me a great introduction, but I'd like to give a little bit more background on my path and what actually led me to where I am today. So I received my Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Rhode Island, and it was during my time at URI that I took my very first internship, which was on Cape Cod National Seashore, working with their shorebird management department. I accepted this internship without any prior experience working with birds or even watching birds, but I was responsible for protecting nesting piping plovers, American oyster catchers, and least terns. On my very first day, the biologist took me to relocate one of the first piping plover broods of the season. We sort of army crawled over the dunes to check out a beach pond where they had been regularly spotted foraging. And I hear the biologist say, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, all 4 chicks are there. Do you see them? Well, I was struggling with my binoculars and I could only see blurry sand, but I lied and said yes. For the rest of that morning, I felt like such an imposter. How on earth was I supposed to protect this bird if I couldn't even see it? That afternoon, we were traveling down the shoreline to another nesting site when the biologist spotted a pair of black-bellied plovers. Amazingly, I figured out how to use my binoculars in that moment and got a clear sight of them. They were in their full breeding plumage, and I was seeing something that I had never seen before. I was totally in awe, and for me, that black-bellied plover was my spark bird, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, a spark bird is the bird that gets you excited about birds. So since then, I've dedicated my career towards avian conservation and management. So yeah, after graduating with my Bachelor's of Science degree, I bounced around with some seasonal field work before landing on Little St. Simon's Island, and that's where I also collected data for my master's research, which experimented with predator exposures around Wilson's plover nesting sites to see how that affected nest success and productivity. And then after graduating with my Master's of Science degree, I took a job with North American Land Trust. And it was while working with that land trust that I started to develop habitat management plans for private landowners interested in improving their land for wildlife. I absolutely love doing that. And that got me thinking about restoration and management for wildlife, particularly birds, having that be a topic that I want to pursue for a PhD. So for this talk, I'm going to share with you some of my PhD research, which is still in progress. I'm at the halfway point of my PhD program, and I just entered my 3rd year. But broadly, I assess the bird community response to habitat restoration prescriptions on the Georgia coast. So to start with a little bit of background, land use change is one of the top threats to biodiversity. This is through habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation, so the isolation of smaller patches from one another. And globally, over the last 50 years, 75% of terrestrial land has been modified, and then 85% of wetlands have been lost. Some of the primary drivers for this change is agriculture, forestry, and urban development. And this habitat loss and fragmentation is very detrimental to wildlife populations. Globally, 25% of all species are threatened with extinction. And many of you are probably familiar with a study that came out in 2019 that reported that since 1970, 3 billion birds have been lost from the North American skies. And so without intervention, species richness will continue to decline by a little over 3%. So what can be done? Habitat restoration. So broadly, habitat restoration is the restorative maintenance of existing systems, as well as the creation of native habitats on disturbed sites. It's a very holistic approach, so it restores the vegetation, the water systems, and the soil conditions, and it improves habitat for wildlife and plants. But before a restoration project begins, it's important to know how to restore, but also how does restoration affect birds, which is what I'm particularly interested in. And that's because birds are indicators of environmental change, so they're going to respond to changes in those restoration prescriptions. So I am researching the effects of restoration on 2 unique types of land covers. 1, a golf course, and then 2, the longleaf pine ecosystem. Because both of these systems are human modified, and they both have a variety of unique challenges and opportunities for restoration. So my goal is to evaluate the avian community response to habitat restoration activities in these 2 land cover types. And so this talk is divided into 2 unique segments. I'm going to start with my golf course research first, and then transition into the longleaf pine research. So starting with golf courses. Golf courses actually originated in Scotland and came to the United States in the late 1800s. And in Scotland, golf courses very much resemble the natural surroundings of the environment. For those of you who golf, you might be familiar with the term link. And in Scotland, a golf link is actually another way to say coastal grassland. So grasslands are very much involved with the historic golf courses in Scotland. But when golf came to the United States, it sort of modified its appearance. There's a lot more land modification, and it became sort of the monocultured landscape that we see now. In the United States, the average 18-hole golf course is about 150 acres, and there's over 16,000 golf courses in the United States alone, which is actually more than the number of McDonald's locations. And this accounts for over 2 million acres of land that is solely dedicated to golf, which is larger than the state of Connecticut. And so to construct these golf courses, one study found that 2/3 of natural vegetation is actually replaced with that turf grass. And to also construct these courses, there's a lot of soil movements, which can lead to soil erosion and soil compaction. To maintain those courses once they're established requires fertilizers like nitrogen and phosphorus. And then often you see sort of the broad application of chemicals too, like insecticides, pesticides, and fungicides to maintain the beauty of the course. And then a lot of water is used on these golf courses too. One study reports that on average, in the Southeastern United States, one golf course uses 98,000 gallons of water per day. So a lot of water is used. But golf courses can also be an opportunity for conservation as well. There's been a 30-year declining trend in golf courses, with 1% of courses closing annually. So this is about 13,000 acres that are taken out of commission each year. And the reason for this is just that there's more supply than demand right now. So this provides a really unique opportunity for habitat restoration to transition those tall turf grass fairways into back to native habitat. And so studies show that courses can support wildlife when its habitat is intentionally managed for conservation. And also moderately disturbed cover types, such as golf courses, are found to have a higher avian species richness and bird biomass than strictly natural and urban areas. And then golf courses also support high numbers of wildlife in a fragmented landscape if biodiversity is included in that design plan, and those courses retain some remnants of native habitat. So overall, birds will occupy golf courses that resemble the natural conditions of a landscape. And this is great news for those large-scale restoration projects because this is predicted to have positive effects on the avian community. So my objective for this part of my research is to assess how the avian community responds to the conversion of a decommissioned golf course to a native coastal grassland vegetative community. A couple of the research questions I'm asking is, how does the conversion of a defunct golf course to native habitat change avian occupancy, species richness, abundance, and diversity? And does the avian community composition shift towards a higher species richness of species associated with grassland habitats following a golf course conversion? My study site is on the Georgia coast. So here we are in the Southeastern United States, right over that red star. And I'm working on Jekyll Island, Georgia, which is a barrier island just off of the coast of Georgia. And Jekyll Island is managed as a state park. It's about 6,000 acres in size. And Jekyll Island is really unique, where only 1/3 of the island can actually be developed, and the 2/3 of it needs to be maintained in natural use. Jekyll Island is managed for conservation and priority wildlife, such as nesting sea turtles, eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, and nesting shorebirds like American oyster catchers. And thousands of people visit Jekyll yearly for the beaches, the biking, golf, tennis, and then also the Sea Turtle Center and some of the history too. And so the Jekyll Island Golf Club is actually 4 courses that's located right in the heart of Jekyll Island. And for the restoration site, it's located in that southwestern corner of that green outline. And this is called the Oleander Golf Course. So Oleander was built in 1910 and then redesigned in 1964. And the reason for its closure is simply drainage and infrastructure issues. It just became too much of a cost to maintain to keep it open for golf. So a decision was made by Jekyll Island Authority to close the golf course and then turn it back over to nature, and then also have it be a community park with walking trails too. So the course was closed in November of 2024. And then in spring 2025, herbicide treatments to remove that turf grass began. And then native plant restoration will begin in fall 2025. And overall, it's about 52 acres of turf grass, and there's patches of pine oak forest mixed in along the edges of those fairways too. And for the wildlife habitat restoration, Jekyll Island aims to transition this over into a maritime coastal grassland. So this is characterized by a few trees, shrubs. Muhlenbergia, which is a species of pink muley grass, is a very dominant species in this community type. And this was once widespread across Jekyll Island in the southeast, but it's now limited primarily due to like successional changes. And regionally priority species depend on these grasslands for survival, such as eastern diamondback rattlesnakes and painted buntings too. And in the past, there have been golf course conversions across the United States, but those conversions did not formally monitor the wildlife. So this is expected to be the first study to examine the effects of a large-scale golf course restoration on the avian community. And so for my data collection, I'm sampling in both the summer and the wintertime to capture the breeding and the non-breeding sampling period. In 2024, I sampled while the golf course was still open and active. So I was doing my bird surveys while there were actually golfers around me. I was trying not to get hit by golf balls. In 2025, the course is closed, but it's in that pre-restoration phase where they've done herbicide treatments, but they have not established native vegetation yet. And then 2026, I'm going to be collecting data in that post-restoration phase after native plants have become established. And I'll also add that in 2025 and 2026, I added a control site. So the two active golf courses just north of the oleander restoration site, I set up equipment out there as well. And this gives you some context of what the golf course actually looks like. So I took this video this past spring after the golf course was closed and after they did some herbicide treatments on the turf grass. This is actually native vegetation that had volunteered to come back up. And it's mostly a mix of dog fennel and a local fireweed species. But it's kind of remarkable that already you can see native plants starting to come back in this area. And as the image transitions down the golf course, you can see some of the pine oak forest edges along the edge of the fairway too. And Jekyll Island Conservation Department does a really great job at managing these edges with prescribed burning. And you can kind of see that some of the palmettos and some of the pine trees are burned in those areas. All right. And so I am using acoustic recording units, ARUs, to collect my bird avian data. And for the golf course research, I chose wildlife acoustic song-meter mini 2s. And the locations of these ARUs were randomized, site selected, and then ARUs were at least 250 meters apart. That way detections weren't duplicated across ARUs. And they were set to record for 2 hours around dawn and 2 hours around dusk daily. So I collected 4 hours of audio per day. And then I also paired those ARUs with avian point counts at each station. So this was a 5-minute distance sampling survey where all individuals were observed by sight and sound and recorded in distance bands of 0 to 25, 25 to 50, and 50 to 100 meter intervals. And then I also recorded the wind and the noise levels as well as the temperature. And I conducted these point counts 3 times per season. And then I also documented habitat features in a 100-meter site radius. So this estimated percent cover of turf grass, natural vegetation, tree canopy, water, and then other, which is essentially structures or other man-made features, which is very prevalent on a golf course. And then I use BirdNet Analyzer to process these recordings using a customized species list. I set it to the highest sensitivity at 1.25, and that used a 2-second overlap with a minimum 80% confidence. And I am in the process of training this model to be more accurate with feature embeddings. So essentially, every bird species has a unique vocalization. And when that's visually represented, such as in that bottom photo, it's essentially pattern matching. So the model can detect what a species is by the way that its sound looks on a sonograph. And then to estimate density and abundance, I used a hierarchical distance model using the R package unmarked. I created 10 models using one site and one detection covariate and used AICC for model averaging. And abundance is simply density multiplied by the total area. And then for the preliminary results that I'm going to show you, I calculated this for two species, the eastern bluebird and the eastern kingbird. And these are two open habitat, early successional species that we would expect would be responding to the restoration on the golf course. And then I also divided species into their communities based on their habitat associations. So the multi-habitat generalists are your backyard birds, the cardinals and the Carolina wrens. The forest species are your forest interior species, and this is either hardwood or hardwood pine, so like eastern wood pewees, for example. Open and early successional species are species that are commonly found in fields, grasslands, edge. Many of your sparrow species fall into this category. Wetland and aquatic species are your water birds, as well as those species found in riparian and mesic forests, like Acadian flycatchers. Pine savanna species are species that are solely dependent on open pine woodlands, like the Bachman sparrow and brown-headed nuthatch. And then I have a category for species that were just simply migrating through and stopping by on their way to their breeding grounds, more northern than where we are here. All right, so this is species richness for the summer of 2024. And again, the golf course was open and active for play during the time. And so across all ARU sites, 72 species were detected, and forest and generalist species occupied the largest proportion of the wildlife community. And for the most vocal species in 2024, that award goes to the Chuck-bill's widow. They are quite vocal. But going down this list, these are all species you would expect to find in moderately disturbed areas, such as fish crows, cardinals, Carolina wrens. And I do want to point out that this chart simply represents the amount of times that a species was detected vocalizing on a recording unit. This does not equal abundance. And then in winter 2024, where the golf course had closed and gone fallow, 54 species were detected across ARU sites. So species richness declined a little bit in the wintertime, but that is to be expected. But overall, community composition was quite similar between summer and winter. And then yellow rump warblers take the award for the most vocal species in the wintertime. If you've ever been in the Southeast in the winter and have gone birding, it's just yellow rump warbler galore. But typically birds are not as vocal in the wintertime as they are in the summer. They don't really have their territories and they're not trying to attract a mate. In the summer of 2025, where I added that control site that's represented on the left-hand side and the restoration oleander site is on the right-hand side of that chart. Overall, species richness was very similar between the two sites. Oleander, the restoration site, had 66 species documented and the control site had 69. There were more migratory species documented on the control site than the restoration site. And I think that's just because there was more sort of forested habitat buffers between some of those fairways. But overall, forest and open and early successional species, as well as generalists, were the most common species on those areas. And again, very similar community structure between the two sites. And in the summertime, Chuck-bill's widows were the most vocal again. And at the restoration site, ospreys and eastern kingbirds were quite vocal as well. And I think this just is naturally from how the sites were randomized and selected. So one of the ARUs was placed near a nesting osprey platform and also near an eastern kingbird territory as well. So they're very much just chipping away near those microphones. Now, going back to 2024 with some eastern bluebird abundance. Overall, the null model was the best supported model. But overall, the model weights were relatively low. So this shows that habitat features had little impact on bluebird abundance, but also there's very little variation in habitat features on these golf course sites. Density came out to 0.42 bluebirds per hectare, and this equated to about 21 eastern bluebirds overall on the site. And then for eastern kingbirds, the top model included tree canopy as the best supporting model. This makes sense. It's an open habitat species. It's not typically going to be found near tree canopies, but overall, looking at those model weights going down the line, there's really no dominating model, which shows that, again, there's very little variation in the habitat features across these ARU sites. For eastern kingbirds, the density came out to be about 0.34, and that equated to about 17 kingbirds at the restoration site in 2024. Some of the preliminary patterns that we're seeing with this data is that across all sampling periods, forest and generalist species make up the largest proportion of the bird community. And that community composition really stays stable year-round. There's also numerous wetland and aquatic species present, and this shows that the golf course ponds are supporting habitat for those water birds. And so this is simply a baseline for evaluating how restoration progresses, and I am continuing my research. And I do expect that habitat features and structure will change over those next sampling periods. And so I predict that in the next 1 to 2 years, forest and wetland species abundance will be stable, while early successional species will increase, such as your indigo buntings, painted buntings, and chats. And then in the moderate to long term, I predict that pine savanna and open habitat species, such as field sparrows and Henslow sparrows, will increase as well as that restoration progresses. So these research results could potentially stimulate and guide the restoration of golf courses throughout the Southeast and beyond. Restored courses could serve as stepping stones or corridors that connect land and fragmented landscapes. But also this data could guide best management practices for restoring or enhancing habitat on golf courses for a multitude of species. All right, and now we are going to transition to the longleaf pine ecosystem. So the longleaf pine ecosystem is essentially a grassland with scattered longleaf pine trees mixed in. It has a very diverse ground cover of wiregrass, legumes, wildflowers, low shrubs, and these are very highly biologically diverse communities. One study found that in a square meter plot, there were 40 plant species found within that plot. But longleaf pine has been affected by habitat loss and degradation as well. Historically, the longleaf pine ecosystem covered 90 million acres across the southeastern United States, but less than 5% of that remains today. The loss is due to conversion to agriculture, pine plantations, development, tree harvest, and fire suppression. And this is an ecosystem that depends on fire for its survival. Fire is really important to facilitate tree growth, but also open up that understory and keep it open for that diverse ground cover, and also to allow wildlife to forage in that understory too. One study found that about 35% of bird and 70% of mammal species forage on the ground in the longleaf pine ecosystem. And there's some species that are endemic to the longleaf pine ecosystem, and those are priorities for conservation because of the reduction in size of this ecosystem across the Southeast. And so the America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative has a goal of increasing 8 million acres of longleaf pine habitat on the landscape. So in order to do this, 3 million more acres is needed to accomplish that goal. So restoration is crucial. My objective for my longleaf pine research is to assess how the avian community responds to various longleaf pine ecosystem restoration prescriptions and at the time since initial restoration activity. Some of the questions that I'm asking is, does a particular restoration technique increase occupancy of longleaf pine specialist bird species in an area? And how long does it take for the avian community to shift towards longleaf pine specialists? And is there a particular restoration prescription that's more effective? All right, so here we are again on the Georgia coast. I just talked about Jekyll Island Golf Club, and that's located about halfway between my two longleaf pine study areas. So I'm working at Altama Plantation Wildlife Management Area and Ceylon Wildlife Management Area. And these are both managed by Georgia Department of Natural Resources. And they are public lands for hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, but also conservation too. Altama Plantation WMA is about 4,000 acres in size. And this was acquired by Georgia DNR in 2015. So overall, the land cover types on this WMA, there's quite a bit of pine forest, hardwoods, riparian corridors. The Altamaha River flows just north of the WMA. So there's a lot of cypress and tupelo swamp forest mixed into kind of near that river. But this WMA stays rather mesic, so it stays a little bit wet, and that creates more of a flatwood condition for that longleaf pine forest. So you find more of a palmetto component in that understory. And so at Ceylon Wildlife Management Area, it's a little bit larger than Altama. It's 27,000 acres in size. And Georgia DNR acquired this property just a few years ago in 2021. And this site is a little bit drier than Altama, so it has more of a wiregrass component in that understory. And there's still some palmetto too, but it's very much the longleaf pine wiregrass community. And so how do we restore longleaf pine on the ecosystem? There's a few ways. I had already mentioned forest fires, prescribed burning is incredibly important to open up that understory and that midstory. Timber thinning to open up that basal area in the forest. You can clear cut areas if there's non-native species. Mulching, again, to open up that understory. And then you can also plant longleaf on the landscape. And this can be in areas that were clear cut or areas that have existing longleaf in the overstory. So you can plant the longleaf plantings and the understory. For my field methods, I use Kilty scientific rangers for this section of my study. And that was because I'm studying both birds and bats in the longleaf pine ecosystem. And these rangers have the capability to record both at the same time. And I use a stratified random sampling design when selecting sites for these ARUs. So my strata was time since initial DNR restoration activity, and also the various restoration prescriptions too. I conducted avian point counts at each ARU station. And then to assess habitat types, I used a 50-meter point intercept vegetation transect. So I was able to estimate the percent cover in each forest strata. And then for this part of my research, I'm sampling in 2025 and 2026, and I just wrapped up my first field season of sampling at these WMAs. And so I have 2 more seasons of winter sampling and 1 more season of breeding season sampling in April and June. And the analytical methods are essentially the same as the golf course analytical methods. I use BirdNet Analyzer to process these recordings. Since I just collected my ARUs from the WMAs a few weeks ago, I've only been able to process a small subset of the data, but I did want to have something to show you today, so that's what I have. So this is species richness by site. So on the left-hand side, we have Altama. On the right-hand side, we have Ceylon WMA. And overall species richness is pretty similar. At Altama, there's 59 species that were detected with the ARUs. At Ceylon, there were 55. And forest and open and early successional species were the most present in that community type. And then probably one of the most important things to note, Bachman sparrows are only present on Ceylon Wildlife Management Area. They're not on Altama yet. And then only yellow-breasted chats were detected on Ceylon as well. For the most vocal species between the 2 study areas, those go to the nightjars and the woodpeckers. But on Ceylon, those priority species that Georgia DNR is managing for, such as the northern bobwhite and the Bachman sparrows, those were quite vocal as well. And looking at the time since DNR started restoration activities for longleaf, so on the x-axis for this graph, you have the number of species. On the y-axis, it's the time period, so less than 1 year, 1 to 2 years ago, 3 to 5 years ago, and so on and so forth. And overall, you can see that community structure is quite similar across all of these time periods, with peak abundance at that 3 to 5 year category. When looking at how this affects some of the priority species for Georgia DNR, Bachman sparrows prefer longer managed stands. And I will note that there were no 7-year plots at Ceylon yet. Otherwise, we would expect that Bachman sparrows would be detected in those older plots too. Forest birds, such as your eastern wood pewees, prefer older managed stands. You're not really going to find them in stands that were recently managed within the past couple of years. And then for your towhees and your indigo buntings, these are your open and early successional species, and they really prefer that 3 to 5 year intermediate timing for the management. And then overall, more species were detected in thin stands versus unthinned stands. So this chart is divided into unthinned areas. If DNR thinned it, so this was thinning within the last 7 years. And then if this tract was thinned prior to the DNR acquisition, so that would be 7 or more years ago. And again, you can see that there's an even distribution of community types across all of these treatments. When looking at timber management time impact on some of these priority birds, Bachman sparrows have a strong presence in these older thin stands, and these are truly your flagship pine savanna species. Brown-headed nuthatches, which are an endemic species in the southeastern United States, they have a very strong presence in older thin stands, but will also occur in those unthinned stands too. And then for northern bobwhites, they really respond well to thinning at any stage. Not going to find them so much in those unthinned stands, but so long as that tract is thinned, that's what they're responding to. And then for yellow-breasted chats, which is the early successional poster species, they respond well to recently thinned areas as well as clear cuts. And now looking at whether longleaf pine was added to the landscape via plantings of saplings. So this chart includes both clear cut and understory plantings. And those forest interior species are less likely to occupy clear cut and replanted areas. This makes sense, right? There's not much forest canopy for them to occupy. And then also those early successional species, they are responding to longleaf being added to the landscape with those plantings, but they also respond to other management too with those prescribed burns and mulching. Some of the preliminary patterns that we're seeing is that pine savanna specialists respond positively to thinning, peaking at intermediate stages of management. Early successional species thrive after immediate thinning, but decline as those stands mature. Forest birds, such as your eastern wood pewees, show a lag in response. And then those community composition shifts with time since restoration began. And so this data is starting to look like it might fit the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So it did show that more species were documented in areas where restoration started 3 to 5 years ago. And so this hypothesis essentially says that disturbance promotes coexistence by preventing competitive exclusion. So when there's low intensity or frequency of disturbance, you have lower species diversity. And when there's high intensity and high frequency of disturbance, you're going to have low species diversity as well. And it really needs that intermediate amount of intensity and frequency of disturbance to promote that species richness. So this model is starting to look like it fits my preliminary results with species richness by time since initial restoration. And with more sampling, I predict that overall species richness will remain stable, but community structure shifts will occur early in succession. Also, early successional species will decline without timber management. Pine savanna specialist activity will increase with older managed stands. And also, I'm calling it now, I think Bachman sparrows will occupy Altama in the next 1 to 3 years. So I'm just going to put that out in the universe and hope it happens. But the habitat looks really great for them. So they should be occupying those areas in the near future. And looking broadly, this research helps to improve avian habitat at a regional scale, which ultimately supports bird populations. And it also fills knowledge gaps for a priority species, such as the northern bobwhite quail, which is a priority game bird for Georgia Department of Natural Resources in the state. And my research is helps inform data-informed restoration decision-making, which ultimately supports Georgia DNR as they effectively restore quality longleaf habitat for wildlife on their public lands. And looking forward, I'm going to continue with data collection and analysis. I have 2 more sampling periods in the non-breeding season in 2025 and 2026. And then I have another sampling period in the summer of 2026, again, to capture that breeding season response. I'm going to be working on my occupancy and abundance models further. And I briefly mentioned it before, but I am also studying the bat response to restoration prescriptions. So I will be analyzing bat data. And I'm also looking at how to turn this project into a long-term monitoring project as well. So for my PhD work, I'm collecting 2 years worth of data, and I'd love to see this turn into a long-term monitoring data set that Georgia DNR can use to inform their restoration management and decisions. And with that, I'd like to thank my support and funding for this work, the Graduate School at the University of Georgia, as well as the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Georgia Ornithological Society, American Ornithological Society, Jekyll Island Authority, and then Wildlife Acoustics. And with that, I will take questions. There's my email. Please reach out if you just want to chat or have any other questions too. I'm happy to talk. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Lauren. Really enjoyed the talk. Uh, I'm thinking about golf courses more than I have in the past now, and how there's so many of them. I couldn't believe it. But thanks so much for educating us on those topics, and I will bring up the chat, the Q&A, and look at any hand raising. So I got everything up here. And uh, I'll start it off. Just have a general question. If that golf course on Jekyll Island had not closed down at a good time for your PhD, um, how would you have addressed this topic, or would this have been a topic you would have addressed?
That's a great question. So when I started to pursue my PhD, originally what led me to this topic was working on a habitat management plan with North American Land Trust, and I helped a defunct golf course in Virginia actually
Hmm.
transition their land back to nature for the community and for wildlife. And while developing resources to develop that habitat management plan, I realized that there's very few limited resources on how to actually do this type of work.
Hmm.
So that got the wheel spin in my head that really this is what I want to pursue. And so having worked on the Georgia coast before, I had connections and partnerships with Jekyll Island and just started reaching out and heard that Jekyll was happening to start this restoration project at the same time that I wanted to do my PhD work. So it was perfect that it just worked out that way. But I mentioned when I start talking with people about my golf course research, they always bring up a golf course that went out of business. They're like, oh, you
Hmm.
should add this as a
I
study
see.
area. You should add that one. So really, if it didn't work out with Jekyll, I'm sure I would be able to
Hmm.
find another site that had closed and I could study the effects of restoration.
Got you. Yeah, that was actually going to be my response as well. Can you add that Virginia one that you started working on? So I was going to say the same thing as what everybody
Yeah,
else said.
unfortunately, I don't think the
Yeah.
timeline works quite for that, but
Yeah.
potentially.
Got you. Got you. Yeah. So right, they're closing all over then. So and then sorry, Joseph asks, any issues with invasive exotic plants on the restoration site?
Yeah, so for the golf course restoration site, obviously
I
like
believe. Yeah.
turf grass, yeah, it would be a non-native species that we have to plan, or that Jekyll Island is planning for to continually manage throughout. There's also Chinese tallow, which is a tree and a shrub that grows along those forested buffers. So there is quite a number of non-native species to manage for, and it's you can't just implement management and restoration once and expect it to work out. It's a continuous process. And then looking at the longleaf pine ecosystem on the WMAs, they're pretty well managed. There's not a whole lot of non-native species on those study areas, but looking elsewhere on the longleaf pine ecosystem, like Kogon grass is a highly invasive species that you have to be on the lookout for. But fortunately, with my study sites, that's not so much of an issue right now.
All right. And uh, I was wondering, you've got the unthinned and then the less than 7 and plus than 7
Hmm.
regions of the longleaf pine. Why is 7 a good cutoff for that?
Good question. So that was simply from when DNR had first acquired the
Oh, I
property.
see. I see.
Yeah, yeah. So whether
That's
the prop,
specific. Mm,
yeah, so whether that tract was thinned prior to acquisition or if they implemented the restoration
mm.
themselves.
Got you. And is after 7 years, I was trying to understand the tree distribution, like how different, just because I know nothing. I don't
Hmm.
know, is unthinned and 7 plus, there's a big difference between that? Or like, so if it hasn't been thinned and if it's been more than 7 years since it's been thinned, is that very different than unthinned, for example?
Yeah, so sometimes you see with stands that were thinned later, later on.
Mm,
So they've had more time to perhaps recover with
yeah,
that understory. It's not quite as disturbed with some of the mechanical trucks and machinery that might have gone through to kind of tear up that understory a little bit.
I see.
Um, but it also allows it more time for sunlight to, reach that understory floor and allow that vegetation to really flourish. So really, it just gives it more time to have a more open basal area, more light to come in through that canopy and allow the understory to recover more.
I see. So it's almost like those are three different things as opposed to one being more
Yes.
similar to the
Yeah.
other. Gotcha.
Yes. Yeah. Good
Uh,
question.
Thanks. And I just have one. I think this might be one more. Um, yeah. So you were saying that the general and forest species make up the greatest number of species in I think in the golf courses and maybe
Hmm.
also the pines, but the golf courses. Um, but were those also had the largest number of species for each of those categories in your data set? In other words,
Mm.
did all categories have an equal number of species and then they made up the largest number, or did they sort of have, I don't want to say an advantage, but like because there's more species in there, you would expect that those would.
No, that's a very good point. There are, it's not even categories.
Mm,
So, especially for those pine savanna species, which I broke out into a
right.
separate category, there's really maybe only a handful of those
Hmm.
that could actually be represented.
Hmm.
So generalists, yeah, there are more species represented in that customized species list, as well as the forest species and the early successional species to a certain extent.
Got you. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
And so an anonymous attendee says, how did you decide on the conditions for your BirdNet analyzer processing? Yeah.
So good question. So for the BirdNet analyzer, processing, I ran through multiple trial runs um, initially to try to kind of detect, see like where am I getting the false positives, the false negatives, and really kind of found that the metrics that I put up there is sort of that sweet spot. But that being said, there's still quite a bit of like false positives with those BirdNet recordings that I had to go to and manually listen to key out, which is why I'm going to go back through and train that model to be better with those embeddings. But yeah, it was a lot of just going through and doing a lot of test runs to really find that sweet spot of where am I detecting species to be the most accurate.
Yeah, I could imagine a lot of fine tuning.
Hmm.
Um, Actually, I sort of have a somewhat of a, like my favorite bird is turkey vulture, and I just love vultures. So, how would you monitor or can you incorporate species that don't have vocalizations into your uh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure that out actually, because turkey vultures too and black
Mhm,
vultures
mhm,
here in the southeast too. They really don't vocalize as much as well as like some of those hawks too,
mhm.
um, and the falcons. Which is why, fortunately, I'm doing point count surveys where I can capture that. So species who may not be
Right.
vocalizing, I'm able to capture that with the point count surveys.
Mhm,
But that is one thing that I am considering. So for those
mhm.
species who are not able to vocalize as much, like how can I sort of incorporate that into the ARU data?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, I think I have. looked at all the, I scrolled in the chat correctly, looked at all the questions, and thank you everyone for being here again. I think we're ready to wrap up. So I want to thank Lauren so much for a great talk. I hope everyone learned about golf courses and longleaf pines like I did. And we'll see everybody next week. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Hey, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yes.